I'll never forget the moment I found my sister crying in the middle of the night, her hands covered in blood that wasn't hers. That was the night we realized the gift she had accepted at the funeral wasn't just a gift, it was a curse. It started a few weeks ago in our small village. My aunt, Mama Adissa, had passed away. She was loved by everyone, and her funeral was a huge gathering. People came from neighboring villages, bringing food, gifts, and their condolences. Among the mourners was a man none of us recognized. A tall, thin man with a face that seemed too smooth, like it wasn't real. He carried a small wooden box wrapped in a red cloth. When it was time to pay respects, he walked straight up to my sister, Emanuela. He smiled a wide, unsettling smile, and handed her the box. "This is for you," he said. Emanuela hesitated but didn't want to be rude. She accepted the gift with both hands and thanked him. The man nodded and left without saying another word. We didn't see him again for the rest of the funeral. That night, Emanuela opened the box. Inside was a simple bracelet made of black beads and a single red stone. It looked handmade and ordinary, but something about it made me uneasy. When I asked Emanuela why he gave it to her, she shrugged. "He said it's a gift to protect me," she replied, slipping it onto her wrist. From that moment, strange things started happening. The first night, Emanuela woke up screaming. She said she had a nightmare about Aunt Adissa calling her name, her voice echoing like she was far away. In the dream, Aunt Adissa was standing by a river, holding the same bracelet. The next day, Emanuela seemed distracted. She kept rubbing her wrist like the bracelet was too tight. "It's nothing," she said when I asked her about it, but I could tell something was wrong. By the third night, I started hearing whispers in the house. They weren't loud, but they were clear enough to make my skin crawl. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers sounded like my aunt's voice, repeating the same words. "Return it." Things got worse. One evening, I found Emanuela standing in the backyard, staring at the moon. Her eyes looked strange, like they weren't hers. I shook her shoulder, and she snapped out of it, but she couldn't remember why she was outside. The whispers grew louder, and now they followed us everywhere. In the market, at school, even in church. It wasn't just me hearing them anymore. Emanuela heard them too. One day, I begged her to take the bracelet off. She tried, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the beads had fused together, tightening around her wrist. "We need to find that man," I said. We started asking around, describing the tall man with the smooth face, but no one knew him. Some people said they hadn't even seen him at the funeral. Others said he sounded like someone who died years ago in another village. Desperate, we went to see the village elder. He listened to our story and frowned deeply. "You should never accept gifts at a funeral," he said. "Some spirits use gifts to tie themselves to the living. This bracelet is not ordinary. It's a bond. What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You must break the bond," he replied. "But be warned, the spirit will fight back." That night, the elder came to our house with a calabash, a white cloth, and some herbs. He said we needed to perform a cleansing ritual to sever the connection between Emanuela and the bracelet. As the ritual began, the air grew heavy. The whispers turned into loud wails, and the lights in the house flickered. Emanuela screamed and fell to the ground, clutching her wrist as the bracelet began to glow faintly. The elder chanted louder, sprinkling the herbs around her. Suddenly, the door flew open, and a cold wind rushed into the room. I swear I saw a shadow standing in the doorway, a tall, thin figure with no face. "Give it back," the shadow hissed. The elder shouted for me to close the door, but my legs were frozen. The shadow stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "Emanuela!" I screamed. "Fight it!" Emanuela writhed on the floor, her face twisted in pain. The bracelet on her wrist glowed brighter, the red stone pulsing like a heartbeat. The elder kept chanting, his voice firm but strained, as if he was pushing against an invisible wall. The shadow figure stepped fully into the room now, towering over all of us. It raised a long, bony hand and pointed at Emanuela. Its voice, low and guttural, echoed in the room. "She is mine. Return the bond, or I will take her with me." "No!" I shouted, finding my voice at last. I ran to Emanuela's side, grabbing her hand, trying to pull the bracelet off. It burned my fingers, but I didn't let go. "Focus on the light," the elder said, throwing more herbs onto the fire in the calabash. The smoke thickened, filling the room with a sharp, earthy scent. "Don't let it take her." Emanuela's eyes fluttered open. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "It hurts," she whispered. "You're stronger than this," I said, my voice trembling. "You can fight it." The shadow lunged forward, its long arms stretching unnaturally as it reached for Emanuela. Just as it was about to grab her, the elder threw the white cloth over the bracelet. The moment the cloth touched it, a deafening scream erupted from the shadow. It stumbled back, its form flickering like a dying flame. The elder pressed his hand over the cloth, chanting even louder now. Emanuela screamed, clutching her wrist as the bracelet seemed to resist, pulling her toward the shadow. "Hold her," the elder yelled. I wrapped my arms around Emanuela, holding her as tightly as I could. The shadow let out a furious roar, its form growing larger, darker. The red stone on the bracelet cracked, releasing a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the room fell silent. The shadow was gone. The bracelet lay on the ground, shattered into tiny pieces. Emanuela was unconscious, her wrist bruised but free. The elder slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. "It is done," he said. When Emanuela woke up, she couldn't remember much, but she said she felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her soul. The elder explained that the shadow was a restless spirit that had latched onto her through the bracelet, using it as a way to stay connected to the living. "You were lucky," he said. "Most people who accept such gifts don't survive." We buried the broken pieces of the bracelet deep in the forest and said prayers to ensure the spirit wouldn't return. After that night, Emanuela was never the same. She was quieter, more cautious, and she never attended another funeral without my company. After that night, the village seemed quieter, as if the shadow's presence had unsettled not just our home but the very earth beneath our feet. Emanuela avoided talking about what had happened. I could tell she was trying to move on, but her silence was heavy, like a stone she carried everywhere. The elder warned us to stay vigilant. "These spirits don't forget," he said one evening when Emanuela and I visited him. "Sometimes they try to return, especially if they believe there's unfinished business." At first, nothing unusual happened. Emanuela slowly returned to her routine, though she stayed away from the people who had been at the funeral, particularly the old man who gave her the bracelet. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he let on, but when I brought it up, Emanuela just shook her head. "It's over," she would say. But I could tell she didn't believe her own words. One night, about a month after the ritual, I woke to a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the shutters, but then I realized it was coming from Emanuela's room. Quiet, rhythmic taps, like fingers on wood. I grabbed a lantern and crept to her door. "Emanuela," I whispered. No answer. The knocking continued. I pushed the door open and froze. Emanuela was sitting on the edge of her bed, her back to me. The moonlight streaming through the window made her silhouette look unnaturally still. "Emanuela," I said again, louder this time. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and her lips moved soundlessly, like she was whispering to someone I couldn't see. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A faint shadow on the wall, not hers. It moved independently, its long, spindly fingers reaching toward her. "Get away from her!" I shouted, rushing forward. Emanuela snapped out of her trance and screamed, scrambling back on the bed. The shadow vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of our heavy breathing in the room. The next morning, we went straight to the elder. He listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. "It's trying to reclaim her," he said grimly. "It's rare, but not impossible. The spirit must have been very powerful, or very angry. What do we do?" I asked, desperate. The elder prepared another ritual, but this one required more than just herbs and chants. He told us we needed to confront the source of the spirit's attachment, the man who had given Emanuela the bracelet. "That's the only way to sever the bond completely," he said. Finding the man wasn't easy. He had disappeared shortly after the funeral, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. Days turned into weeks as we searched, following rumors and whispers. Emanuela grew more withdrawn, her nights plagued by strange dreams and the feeling of being watched. Finally, we found him in a neighboring village, living in a run-down hut on the outskirts. He looked even older than I remembered, his face lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes sunken. "You shouldn't have come here," he said when he saw us. "You gave her that cursed bracelet," I said, anger boiling over. "You need to fix this." The man shook his head. "I didn't curse it," he said quietly. "It was already cursed when it was given to me. I was trying to rid myself of it. I thought if someone else took it willingly, the spirit would leave me alone." Emanuela stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "You knew it was dangerous, and you gave it to me anyway?" The man didn't answer. The elder, who had come with us, stepped in. "We're not here for excuses," he said. "We're here to end this." He performed a cleansing ritual on the man, forcing him to confess everything he knew about the spirit. It turned out the bracelet had belonged to a woman who died under mysterious circumstances. She had been wronged in life, and her anger had turned her spirit into something vengeful, latching onto the bracelet as a way to stay tethered to the living world. The ritual ended with us burying the bracelet's remains in sacred ground, far away from any village. The elder said prayers, asking the spirit to find peace at last. After that, the shadow never returned. Emanuela slowly began to heal, but the experience changed her. She became more cautious, more guarded. And as for me, I never looked at funerals the same way again. If you ever find yourself at a funeral and someone offers you a gift, remember this story. Some gifts come with a price, and that price might be more than you're willing to pay. After the burial of the bracelet, life in the village slowly returned to normal. But for Emanuela and me, the ordeal left scars that weren't visible. I could tell Emanuela was trying to move forward, but there was a weight in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The elder, sensing our unease, paid us a visit one afternoon. He sat under the mango tree in front of our house, chewing on a kola nut, his expression thoughtful. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice calm and reassuring. "But there's one more thing you must understand. Spirits like that don't just feed on objects, they feed on emotions. Fear, anger, regret. They're like fuel for them. If you hold on to those feelings, you leave the door cracked for them to return." That night, Emanuela and I sat by the fire, talking about everything that had happened. It was the first time Emanuela opened up about the nightmares she'd been having, the whispers she thought she heard in the quiet hours of the night. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Even though the shadow is gone, I still feel haunted." I reached for her hand. "You're not alone," I said. "We'll get through this together." We decided to visit the sacred site where the bracelet had been buried. The elder suggested it might help Emanuela find closure. It was a long journey, deep into the forest where the air felt heavier, the trees older, and the silence almost too loud. When we arrived, the elder performed a final blessing, asking the spirits of the land to watch over Emanuela and keep her safe. As the ceremony ended, Emanuela stepped forward and knelt by the mound where the bracelet lay buried. "I forgive you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know who you were or what happened to you, but I hope you find peace now." In that moment, something shifted. The air grew lighter, and the forest seemed to breathe again. Emanuela stood, her shoulders straighter, her face calmer than I'd seen in weeks. As we walked back to the village, I noticed her smiling faintly. "I feel free," she said softly. Life moved on, as it always does. The villagers spoke less and less about the incident, and Emanuela began to reclaim her sense of self. She spent more time with her friends, laughed more, and even returned to the market without the shadow of fear following her. But she never forgot the lesson we learned. Neither did I. Years later, Emanuela became a storyteller, sharing her experiences with children and travelers who visited our village. She didn't tell them everything, but she always ended her tales with a warning. Not all gifts are blessings. Some carry the weight of pain, anger, or regret. And some, no matter how beautiful, are best left untouched. As for me, I still think about that shadow from time to time, especially when I pass by the elder's hut or hear the soft hum of the forest at dusk. It reminds me that the world is full of mysteries, some best left unexplored. If you've ever been offered something that feels too good to be true, think twice. Because sometimes, the cost isn't measured in coins or favors. It's measured in the things you can't see until it's too late.